bright and early. Here we are, 8:30 in the morning, ready to learn about literacy. Very exciting. Thank you to everyone who joined us and is joining us. My name is, you can just call me Katie Bouchot. Actually, we're both Katies. I'll let my co-presenter present herself as well.
Good morning. I'm the second Katie.
Yeah, so Katie and I have been working together for a lot of years. I don't think we like to count because we just makes us feel really old. But we're really excited to talk to you today about vocabulary, specifically a strategy called Word Walk Plus, which builds upon our previous work with Word Walk that's designed to provide explicit, engaging vocabulary instruction in the context of shared storybook reading or your interactive read alouds. So our plan is to move through some of the evidence that provides that strong rationale for explicit vocabulary instruction for young children. And then we'll get into looking at what a word walk lesson will look like, some extension activities, and we'll end with some questions and answers. If anyone has some questions, we would love to take them. Katie, do you want to get started? Oh, there's our welcome and thank you.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk about the evidence and rationale for explicit vocabulary instruction, and then transition into the instructional method that we designed, Word Walk Plus. Talk about what a lesson would look like in your classroom so that you could implement it tomorrow if you wanted. The words that you should teach, how to select those, how to plan a lesson with Word Walk. And then finally, we know extensions are incredibly important for built-in review and reinforcement of word learning. So we'll talk about some of those opportunities if we have time at the end. And then, of course, have some opportunity for questions and discussion. We're welcoming questions in the chat, and also we'll make sure that we save time at the end of the presentation. So I'll start with some of the background research on vocabulary instruction. The Word Walk Plus routine is part of your shared storybook reading context. We know from research that shared storybook reading is really crucial for early literacy development, especially in the target grades that we're really focusing our research on, which is preschool and kindergarten. And it includes all instances of an adult reading to a child, a group of children, small group, whole group, but it's dialogic. It includes engagement of those students and discussion around what's happening in the book, but also what's happening outside of the text. So that rich, wonderful discussion is a ripe opportunity to bring in explicit vocabulary instruction. And we know from research that that context is powerful in terms of developing students' short-term and long-term reading development. Of course, in a shared storybook reading, we could target many of our pillars or keys for reading: oral language, comprehension, phonological awareness, print awareness. But today we're going to specifically focus on vocabulary development. And as Katie shared, this has been one of the areas of research that we've worked on ever since our time together in graduate school. So vocabulary is one of the skills that are important to reading. Obviously, we have constrained skills which are absolutely crucial. Knowing the alphabet, knowing the sounds the letters make, putting that together in terms of decoding. And I love the analogy that those skills act as a bridge that take us over a very specific time in our development as readers. But also important are those unconstrained skills that don't have a finite ending, but we're continuously learning and adding even on through our adult life. And vocabulary is one of those, right? Vocabulary learning, word knowledge never truly ends. There are words that I'm learning all of the time still today. And those skills you can think of as hiking shoes that allow us to continue to explore our cognitive world. So I really like that analogy of there's the constrained skills, which are the bridge, but also the unconstrained skills as our hiking shoes that allow us to continue to travel in our literacy journeys. So way to contextualize vocabulary, of course, Scarborough's reading rope we know that vocabulary is an important element of language comprehension. Without a very solid foundation in vocabulary knowledge, word knowledge, it's very difficult to understand what you're reading. You may be able to decode, sound out words, say them, but if you don't know what they mean, then comprehension will ultimately suffer. And so developing vocabulary is an absolutely crucial component of our literacy instruction with learners. So why focus on vocabulary in particular? We know that children who have been exposed to rich and wonderful words are prepared to start to build the language skills necessary to become readers, especially when they get into formal schooling. If they come to us with a foundation of word knowledge, they're better equipped to begin that process of putting the pieces together to comprehend and understand what they're reading. Oral vocabulary at the end of first grade is a significant predictor of comprehension 10 years later. And that statistic is always just very fascinating to me, that the words that you know at the end of, when you're 6 years old are going to predict your ability to actually understand text when you're 16 years old. That's a very powerful predictor of literacy. And we also know from research that meaningful differences exist among our young children in terms of the language that they're exposed to. And the Hart and Risley study, Meaningful Differences, really indicate that children have a difference in terms of the amount of words, but also the types of words that they're exposed to early on. And that unfortunately is really tightly connected to economic status. So we want to go into a little bit more about what this means. It's a wonderful study. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend Meaningful Differences in the Everyday Experiences of Young American Children, Betty Hart and Todd Risley. We draw on this research quite a bit. The findings are fascinating. The researchers found that by age 3, the spoken vocabulary recorded in the homes of children varying of different economic statuses were larger than other homes. And they categorized children from professional families, so career families, homes where the parents were doctors, lawyers, teachers, and they compared that to what they called welfare families, so families that were living below the poverty line. And when looking at the number of words exposed to in the home alone, there was a quantity difference that was striking. So that children growing up in those professional homes heard 11 million words, while children growing up in the welfare family homes heard just 3 million in a year. And so the sheer volume and the difference in quantity obviously has a big impact in terms of exposure of words. You can see that again represented in this chart, just the number of words by year and by hour that the researchers were able to break down along those socioeconomic lines, which made a very huge, meaningful difference. But that was not the only thing. Also, a difference arose from the research in terms of the types of language that children were being exposed to. And again, this is before they got to kindergarten. The types of words the researchers were able to kind of categorize into encouragements and discouragements. And children in professional families heard a higher ratio of encouragements to discouragements than children growing up in welfare families. And again, this made a difference in terms of the types of vocabulary words they were being exposed to create that foundational word knowledge. Children from low-income homes remain well behind their economically advantaged peers when they start formal schooling, and this has been termed the vocabulary gap. This visual always, again, is very astounding to me. The Matthew effect, which is based on the parable of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Children who have that start early on, that foundation of quantity of words, but also types of words in their home, come to kindergarten with an advantage. And so you can see there's a gap in kindergarten between the top line, which is families from that professional status that Hart and Risley looked at, versus children from more welfare, socioeconomically disadvantaged families. So you can see the gap starts early, but notice what happens over time as children go from kindergarten through 12th grade. School doesn't narrow that gap. In fact, it gets larger. And this is the really discouraging part about our vocabulary gap is it's very difficult once that gap is established in early childhood to narrow the gap and have our disadvantaged peers catch up to their more advantaged peers. And partly that's because if you start out with a larger vocabulary knowledge and you have this wonderful foundation of word learning, you start to begin to read, you seek out those experiences, it becomes easy, you start to read more and more, you're exposed to more tier 2, tier 3 vocabulary words. However, if you start with a disadvantage and you're catching up in kindergarten, it might be more of a struggle to learn to read. And if it's more of a struggle, you may seek out fewer experiences. You may be reading less. And over time, that leads to less exposure to different kinds of vocabulary words. And there we have the gap that continues to grow across school. So one of the things we wanted to do is think about what do we know from research that will help us overcome this Matthew effect, this vocabulary gap. We know that there are barriers, so we should acknowledge those barriers up front in our work with children. We know that limited or unsubstantial verbal interaction between parents and children is a huge factor in terms of exposing young children to new words. We know that parents' education level plays a part in the types of words that they're using at home and exposing children to early on in their development. We know that family involvement, getting out into the community, exposing children to rich experiences can shape vocabulary. Certainly school attendance, consistency when children are able to start schooling matters. Access to summer enrichment activities and continual education so that we don't have that summer slump occurring. And then finally, which what we're here today to talk about is teacher knowledge about effective reading practices that we can do in the classroom to help overcome this Matthew effect. Word exposure, children should hear and work with words early and often. We should really be thinking about words across the curriculum at all times of our school day. We want to play with words. We want to have children sing, be exposed to poetry, rhyming words. We want to talk with children at all times, having conversation during transitions, during the beginning of the day, during snack time, during lunch, anytime we're waiting in line. All of those opportunities become teachable moments where we can engage children in word learning. We want to read to children daily. This is something that within the shared storybook context, our explicit vocabulary instruction comes into play. We want to give children an opportunity to experience and engage with meaningful words and use new words that they can map on to words they already know. So we'll be talking today a little bit about how do we choose the words that will have the most impact in our instruction. We also want to engage families in this work. We want to talk with families about using different kinds of words, if possible, reinforcing the words that we're learning in the classroom at home as well. And we want to advocate for equity. We want to make sure that all children have opportunities to learn new words and to understand their meanings. So when we look at vocabulary instructional practices, there are certain themes that emerge from the research. We know that our instructional practices that are more effective integrate. They connect new vocabulary words with words that children already know or their prior knowledge. And this makes sense. If we can connect a new word to a word that they have already in their schema, then they're going to stick and they're going to learn how to use those words appropriately. We also know from research that repetition is absolutely crucial. Young children need to hear the words, use the words, And one shared storybook reading is not enough. They need to be able to be exposed to those words, practice with those words, and engage with the same words multiple times. And so being able to bring in an instructional routine and then reinforce those words across an academic year is challenging. And it also requires some planning and thought on how to get that into the curriculum. And then finally, and very important, is making sure that we're choosing words that make sense, that our children don't already know. Sometimes that's not the words suggested in a curriculum. I've worked with curriculum where the words were way too easy. The children already knew them from their oral language. So taking some time to think about what words make the most sense for your students and why, and then making sure that we build in opportunities for children to use them in meaningful ways, both in reading, but also in writing and discussion as well. Our word walk routine is based on the research of Beck and McGowan, thinking about their text strategy of text talk, again, built in shared reading. So that very powerful opportunity for teachers to read and engage with discussion around what they're reading. Using that to explicitly teach target vocabulary words in a repeated reading format. And we know from Bringing Words to Life, another wonderful text by Beck, McGowan, and Coogan, that really engaging children in vocabulary involves targeting and introducing specific vocabulary words during shared storybook reading. Again, just as the research tells us, repeating our work with those specific words over time, providing child-friendly definitions. We wish that there was a child-friendly definition fairy who sprinkled in the word definitions for us. It's challenging sometimes to come up with our own child-friendly definitions, and we'll share some of the things that we've done in Word Walk to create those child-friendly definitions. We want to make sure that we're consistent in explaining how the words are used within the context of the book that we're reading and sharing with students, but also using those same words outside of the context of the shared storybook reading so that they know that those words live outside of that particular book as well, and they can be used in their everyday lives. And then finally, providing opportunities for children to discuss the words as they relate to their own lives. And they love hearing how the words relate to their teacher's life as well. That can be a really great way to engage children.
Yeah, I'm gonna move it because
Um,
what was I gonna say? Because
we're going to move now. I think someone needs to mute. Thank you. We're going to move now to the word walk strategy, and I'm going to turn the discussion over to my colleague, Katie Beauchat.
Okay, I am ready. Let's talk about word walk. So Katie provided that rich research and rationale for word walk and word walk plus. And so you're going to see a lot of that research play into the development of the protocol of word walk for the before, during, and after piece. So a lot of that you'll see plays right into development of word walk. So word walk is an instructional routine. It was developed for young children. Katie and I were working at the University of Delaware at their early childhood center, and we were doing some research prior to word walk, focusing on best practices and supporting at that time Head Start teachers in having a rich and robust interactive read aloud where they were focusing on multiple targets. And the one target area that they did struggle with when we were going back and reflecting on the study was vocabulary, because we were looking at previous research. Katie mentioned Text Talk by Beck and McGowan. And in Text Talk, really the bulk of the vocabulary discussion was after reading. It wasn't an introduction to vocabulary prior, and not a lot of focus during. It really was this rich discussion, which was fabulous afterwards. And there was only one day of text talk with the introduction of those words. And so the teachers we were working with said, hey, this is great, but our students are really struggling with the vocabulary piece and coming up with their own definitions and coming up with their own explanations, they needed a lot more than one reading. And we thought about that, and that is where Word Walk came from. So it was originally designed for young children, early childhood, but certainly those of you working, in elementary and beyond, it certainly can be modified because it's based on the book that you're reading and the words that you're choosing within that book. So obviously that's going to grow and change over the grade levels. So the lesson learned was that children need more than one reading, focusing on the same words. So in day one, we provided lots of rich oral language support and modeling and thinking aloud, so that day two, they can take more of the onus on of developing their own definitions and actions and stories connected to the words. The other piece in text talk was there was 3 words, sometimes up to 5 words chosen per read aloud and per introduction. We found that the youngest students we were working with, Head Start, pre-K, kindergarten, this was too much. The idea is less is more. I remember when I went to school with my vocabulary instruction involved getting 25 words on a Monday and then, being tested on it on a Friday. And then, maybe you'll remember one by the next Monday. So less is more. What we're looking for is breadth and depth, so that they have really a strong understanding of that word and can use it in conversations and in their writing and in their speaking and their listening, right? So 1 to 2. And for our older students, you can move up to 3, but again, really no more than 5. Because again, are you really getting to the depth of the understanding of that word? The other big piece was we infuse explicit instruction before, during, and after, so that children are alerted to the word prior, and we think about the word during, and we have this great conversation with the words after. And that way they're getting, many doses of that explicit instruction, increasing the likelihood of them using the words on their own. So again, a big piece to Word Walk is making sure that you're looking through your books, you're finding those target words that are going to be really meaningful, and we'll talk about some tips for that, but that you're targeting them before, during, and after reading. And that explicit instruction is really where you see that growth in vocabulary. Okay, so a big piece that we're talking about is certainly the science of reading. The science of reading has been around for a long time. Whenever we had our earliest, documented reading research. So the term now is science of reading, and really the science of reading is just this evidence we have in the research that tells us, what practices are most effective. And, we had the National Reading Panel report that established the 5 pillars of reading. And the science of reading has kind of expanded on that, right? Thinking about other things like morphology and spelling and writing, and really making sure that we have systematic, explicit instruction, that we are working towards mastery of those skills and really targeting early on those foundational skills. And so, that we can see it being implemented in different ways. And certainly for the science of reading in early childhood, it is not just phonics and phonemic awareness. We see that a lot happening in our schools, that we just are focusing on that. But we cannot forget, Katie mentioned those unconstrained skills. Certainly the constrained skills are extremely important. They're critical for reading and spelling. But we also have to grow their understanding of language, of literature, of books, nonfiction, fiction, grow their background knowledge, their world knowledge. That's also figured in a lot in recent science of reading discussions. So word walk really fits in beautifully to the science of reading. And we talked about the Matthew effect. We talked about the meaningful differences study. One of the big pieces, and the Institute of Educational Sciences puts out these kind of practice guides. I really suggest, everyone take a look at them because it basically has gone through the research to say this is effective, this may not be as effective. And it's really important that our first time around with our students, where we are doing what is effective. We have so long to teach them to read. So in science of reading, we know through the research that it's important to engage children, and we're talking about young children here. We have to be thinking about developmentally appropriate practice. There's a lot of conversation. Is science of reading appropriate for young children? Of course it is. It would be inappropriate not to introduce students to the skills needed to be lifelong successful readers. And so it's really important that we are not just thinking about can they read, but can they think? And, for young children, we want to set that bar high. A lot of the teachers that I've been working with recently in pre-K, when teaching Head Start and teaching word walk, were just amazed at the vocabulary gains their children were making in the classroom and going home and using these words in conversations. They just never really thought that they should be teaching those kinds of words in their classroom, but they certainly should, because the words that we introduce now, they can't read on their own, but certainly we introduce them, we talk about them, and when they do come across those words in their reading, they're going to have that comprehension. And Katie talked about that. We have to understand 95% of the words that we read for accurate comprehension. So you can see how incredibly important it is. The earlier, the better that we introduce students to vocabulary. And the books that you're going to be reading to them every day are where you find those words. Outside of courtroom testimony, it's the highest level of language, of vocabulary usage that we'll see, and that lives in children's storybooks. It's language that they're not hearing every day in their conversations at home and in school, but you open that book and you introduce them to these words. It's a really magical, wonderful thing that will aid them both short term and long term. So we can see these pieces here that really fit in with vocabulary and science of reading, meaningful discourse around their interests. You want to have that strive for 5 conversation, that 5-point conversation, building vocabulary knowledge intentionally. So that comes when you're thinking, you have that book and you're like, let me take a look at these wonderful words in here. What makes sense? Katie had talked about that curriculum. They'll provide you vocabulary, but how does a curriculum know what your students need? You do. And so there's a lot of freedom and choice in this as well. Shared storybook reading, oral language, print features, world knowledge. We should be reading all kinds of books to our students, not just relying on fiction, but a big piece in the science of reading, and it's been around for a bit, but it's kind of reemerged, is the idea of pairing a fiction book and a nonfiction book. So if you were, learning about weather, maybe you would read a book by Gail Gibbons on clouds, but then you could also read Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, right? So connecting those two. The writing piece is essential. Get those pencils in their hand as soon as they're able to, and really understand those stages of emergent spelling and move them through that, and certainly build world and content knowledge. When you send your kiddos to the library, most of the time they will come back with a nonfiction book. I know my daughter always did. So did my son, because they're interested in stuff, right? They want to learn about stuff. So it's a misnomer that we should only be reading fiction, or that children only like fairy tales. That's really not true. There's actually a lot more when they look at read alouds between a fiction and a nonfiction. There's actually a lot more conversation that happens in the nonfiction read aloud because they're learning that content. So, okay, Katie, did you want to talk about the results? We did, it was very exciting. We had a chance to, we had already developed Word Walk, but we're like, does this work? So we were able to study Word Walk in 16 Head Start classrooms with really some exciting results.
Right. So before we get into what the word walk strategy is, we want to show that it is effective. We were able to compare two groups of classrooms. 8 classrooms used the word walk strategy for explicit vocabulary instruction. 8 classrooms read the same storybooks and had the same normal shared storybook routine that they normally would have, but they did not have explicit vocabulary instruction using the word walk strategy before, during, and after. We gave pre-tests and post-tests. We used the test of oral language development, the TOLD-4, before and after the academic year, and using word walk for an entire year. And we also administered a curriculum-based measure of the words that we actually targeted for explicit instruction, again, both before and after. And for both tests, we used a subtest which encouraged children to, when given a word, to point to the picture that best illustrated that word, which was that, receptive vocabulary. But then we also had an oral piece or component where they had to provide a definition of that word, so their ability to express the vocabulary knowledge. We worked with 32 teachers in the study. We worked with Head Start classrooms, and you can see the breakdown of the teachers and also the children. Since it was a Head Start setting, all of the children qualified for Head Start, meaning that they were living below the poverty line, and many of the children in our study were English language learners. So you can see some of the results, the picture vocabulary test of our words that we actually explicitly taught during the year using the word walk strategy. At the beginning of the year, the two groups were very similar in terms of their ability to point to the picture of a word that we were asking them to point to. But by the end of the academic year, the students in the 8 classrooms where the teachers were using word walk every week with target words were able to point to the words correctly much more often than those students in classrooms that were not using the word walk method. Similarly, in terms of oral language, this was very astounding to us. At the beginning of the year, when we administered the assessments, many of the children would just smile or nod, but didn't say anything at all. By the end of the study, those that were in classrooms using the word walk method were able to verbalize a correct definition of those target words. Even words that were at the beginning of the year, by the end of the year, they still remembered and were able to express those words, which is just astounding to us. Really, really exciting. In terms of the standardized vocabulary measure, again, typically it's hard to move a standardized assessment score from one academic year, but results indicated that there was a difference between the two groups of students, the comparison group and the word walk group, on the TOLD, and these were words that we did not target. So what does that tell us? It tells us that once the classrooms were starting to really look at words and think about words and engage in word work throughout the entire year, there was an effect where children just started to accumulate more words and more understanding of how words connected, and were able to then apply that to the words that were not targeted explicitly during the word walk routine. So really exciting and encouraging work with that one study, and it really encouraged us to keep going and keep working with classrooms to think about how we could use word walk and then word walk plus with future groups of students.
So we had looked at word walk, and we had these great results, and we were thinking, well, what else do we need to be doing? Because in word walk, we had always talked about extending, right? Making sure you went beyond the read aloud. But word walk plus put that into play in the actual protocol itself. And the two big pieces that we added, that is the plus, is we added actions. So there are actions connected to the words, and we'll look at that in just a second. And then the extensions that we talked about that they were embedded in the protocol too. So the teachers were thinking about, okay, after my word walk read aloud, I know that I'm going to be doing at least 2 other extension activities in my instruction, and maybe encourage students to do some too as well at home or school. So that's embedded in the plus piece too, because we're thinking about, how do we grow those results? How do we grow the repetition? How do we grow their vocabulary? And just making it much more robust in the classroom outside of just the read aloud. So let's take a look at a Word Walk Plus lesson. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is choose, and it says choose the perfect book, and that's whatever that perfect book is for you, depending upon what your lesson is, depending upon what your standard is, your objective. But so you found the book that you're going to be using for your lesson. Now here we're going to be looking at fiction. We're going to be focusing on tier 2 vocabulary. But again, this could be also used with nonfiction books, looking at those tier 3 vocabulary words. So when you're looking for your perfect book, there's we have lots of wonderful literature out there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every book would be appropriate for a word walk lesson, right? So obviously, the big piece is you want to make sure there's target words in the book, which we call wonderful words or target words. And, not every book has them. We love Brown Bear. It's great for concepts of print and tracking print and oral language and colors and all kinds of things. But there's no tier 2 vocabulary in there, so to speak, right? So it wouldn't be ideal for a word walk lesson. So you want to make sure that your book has at least 2 wonderful words that are appropriate for you to teach, and that the book is interesting. It has an interesting storyline, because within word walk there are 2 days. Remember, day 1 you're doing more of the language modeling, and day 2 you're kind of turning over that responsibility. But the teachers that we work with in Head Start, some of them were doing 5-day read alouds where they were targeting different areas of literacy, but really honing in on that vocabulary repeated times, a lot of comprehension work as well, predictions and things like that. So 2 days would be the minimum for the word walk. Certainly you could think about extending it. Okay, so you have your book. You found the words. So, okay, now what do I do with these words? First thing you want to do is create child-friendly definitions. And so again, Katie mentioned there's no tier 2 like dictionary, right? So teachers, you develop these words on your own. What's important to keep in mind is that your child-friendly definition should contain tier 1 words. That means words that they already know. Katie talked about in the research that it's important for integration. So you're taking a word they already know and applying a more sophisticated word that they're going to be coming across in their reading and using in their writing in your lesson, right? So if we take a look here, one of the words we're going to be hearing today in the book, The Wolf's Chicken Stew, is scrumptious. And scrumptious would be considered a tier 2 word. The tier 1 word for scrumptious would be tasty or yummy. So the child-friendly definition is something that is tasty or yummy. So you're introducing that definition to your students. They know what yummy is, but now instead of saying yummy, they can say the wonderful word scrumptious. Which is a lot of fun. So you just want to make sure that they're short definitions, and they usually begin with something, just very brief, kind of like a phrase, not a dictionary definition, a definition they can immediately attach to. So we also used and think about always Beck and McGowan's construct here for tiers of words. And it's, ever since I learned it, we kind of looked at it. It's been very helpful to think about, here's my, here's language. Here's these books. How am I going to choose words? The biggest tier is tier 1. And these are words that we already know, already use, children already know and already use every day. Baby, happy, go, cake, like, right? Those are words that we're going to use in our language, but we do not have to take any time to teach, okay? Tier 2 is that middle layer, and that really is where Beck and McGowan focus their work and where we say we get more bang for our buck in a tier 2 word, because these are high frequency words to be used across all contexts, not just in your ELA lesson. These words are going to be helpful in their life, in schooling, in writing. They're going to come across these words, and it's really important, especially in these early grades where they don't have the decoding fluency, but they have that listening comprehension, and we can and should introduce these words in our read alouds because they're going to be coming across these words. So we have to think long term for these students outside of our classroom. So we know that, so here's some examples of, we heard scrumptious. Hilarious would be a tier 2 word, and the tier 1 word would be funny, right? So that helps you to develop your definitions. And the thing about tier 2 words we talked about before is we don't hear them a lot in regular oral language. We don't hear a lot, hilarious, endure, despise, arrange all the time in our classrooms, right? But we find those words in children's books. And our job is to bring those words out of the books and make them a reality in our classroom, because they're high frequency in books and written language, but not high frequency in oral language. So really taking a look at our books as a source of vocabulary growth is essential. And tier 3 is that top layer there, the smallest layer, and that's because those are content words. So if you're doing a nonfiction lesson, let's say you're doing something on the water cycle, you would have evaporation, precipitation, right? Condensation. And those would be words critical for your nonfiction lesson. And the same idea, you could be targeting these words before, during, and after, and giving them child-friendly definitions. Something that we don't want to do, particularly with young children, is play vocabulary guessing games. For our older students, we can do things like possible sentences where they do some predictions with sentences, and then they read and then they change their prediction. But really, it's important we tell students the definition, and then what they are then asked to do is expand upon that so they can describe in their own words, come up with authentic scenarios using those words. But it's important that we give them those child-friendly definitions. So you're looking in your book and you find 10 possible words for your lesson, right? Or you just need some guidance in choosing words. These are very helpful to think about when you're choosing your 2 words for your lesson. Is the word unfamiliar? You don't want to teach a word that they already know, right? So is it unfamiliar to them? And only you know that, not the curriculum. Could they use this word outside of this lesson? So let's say the word is hilarious. Are they going to hear that word, see that word? Yeah, useful in many contexts. Can I explain it in child-friendly definitions? Hilarious, something that is really funny. Yes, I can. Easier said than done with some words. Katie talked about not having access to a tier 2 dictionary. And so we, in the study that she discussed, we pre-selected the words, right? Because we had to pre and post test them. And some were just a breeze and some were much more difficult. And we had to question, should we be using this word? Because if it's hard to explain in child-friendly definitions for you, think about how your students are going to struggle and be confused with that as well. Can you picture using your students using these words in their own conversations? Oh my gosh, that is almost an assessment for you as an educator. If you start to hear them use those words without prompting, or you start seeing it show up in their writing, that's an excellent thing. It's moved from you into their permanent vocabulary stores. And certainly for both tier 2 and tier 3, this applies as well. Critical for comprehension. And we remember how many words we need to know in order for comprehension of a text. So these words have also been called Goldilocks words, the tier 2 words in the literature. They're not too easy, right? Like a tier 1 word. We don't need to learn a tier 1 word. We know that already. Not too hard, like, metamorphosis, like a tier 3 word, but just right, are the tier 2 words, right? And they tend to be adjectives or adverbs. So when you're thinking about tier 2 words, scrumptious, hilarious, they tend to live in there. And our tier 3 words, they tend to be more nouns, right? Because it's a thing, right? So that's another way to think about it. So tier 2 words are not too hard, not too easy. They're just right. Now, if we were all together, we could say that all together. Okay. So the next thing you're going to do, what's really important for Word Walk, is having some resources for the lesson. So you're going to create a vocabulary picture card. And so you see the target word is featured there. The child-friendly definition is right under there. And of course, you have chosen the word and you have developed the child-friendly definition. And then you're going to find a picture that best matches that. And that picture is up to you, right? The next thing you're going to do is go through your planning. You're going to develop your action for the word. We think that connecting the action and the meaning is really, really important. So for example, we're going to be hearing scrumptious in just a second. We would have students rub their tummy when they heard the word scrumptious in the story. So that action is connected. And that has a lot of research backing it as well. Ready for the next slide? Thanks, Katie. Okay, so these are the steps in a word walk lesson. Okay, so you have your picture card. You're going to introduce the picture card in the beginning of the story. You're going to show them the card. You're going to talk about what it says. You're going to give them the child-friendly definition, and then you're going to ask them to repeat that word. So saying that word a lot also helps cement that in their memory. You're going to give them the child-friendly definition. You're going to show them the action connected to that. And then you're going to say, okay, can you show me that action? What word are we listening for today? Scrumptious, right? So you go through those very simple steps. And so each time you do a word walk lesson, those are the steps. You're just changing basically the word and the picture. And it'll become intuitive after some time. And while you're reading, you're going to read your book as you normally would. You can certainly ask questions, do predictions, things like that. But you're going to pause while you're reading when you come to that word, in this case, scrumptious, and you're going to see if students were listening for that word and giving you that action. And you can give them the quick child-friendly of that word again, or you can give them a thumbs up just to let them know that you're listening. Very good. And that's explicit vocabulary instruction. Okay, so I'm actually going to go through and read Wolf's Chicken Stew. Okay, so what word are we listening for today? Scrumptious. What does scrumptious mean? Something tasty or yummy. And when you hear the word scrumptious, you're going to rub your tummy because that shows that it's scrumptious. Okay, there once lived a wolf who loved to eat more than anything else in the world. As soon as he finished one meal, he began to think of the next. One day, the wolf got a terrible craving for chicken stew. All day long, he walked across the forest in search of a delicious chicken. Finally, he spotted one. Ah, she is just perfect for my stew, he thought. The wolf crept closer, but just as he was about to grab his prey, he had another idea. If there was just some way to fatten this bird a little more, he thought, there would be all the more stew for me. So the wolf ran home to his kitchen and he began to cook. First, he made 100 scrumptious, is everybody rubbing their tummies? I can't see you. Pancakes and left them on the chicken's porch. Eat well, my pretty chicken, he cried. Get nice and fat for my stew. The next night, he brought 100 scrumptious, tasty and yummy donuts. Eat well, my pretty chicken, he cried. Get nice and fat for my stew. And on the next night, he brought a scrumptious, cake weighing 100 pounds. Eat well, my pretty chicken, he cried. Get nice and fat for my stew. At last, all was ready, and this was the night he had been waiting for. He put a large stew pot on the fire, and he set out joyfully to find his dinner. That chicken must be as fat as a balloon by now, he thought. Let's see. But as he peeked into the chicken's house, the door opened suddenly and the chicken screeched, "Oh, so it was you, Mr. Wolf." Children, children, look, the pancakes and the donuts and that scrumptious, tasty and yummy cake. They weren't from Santa Claus. All those presents were from Uncle Wolf. So the baby chicks jumped all over the wolf and gave him 100 kisses. Oh, thank you, Uncle Wolf. You're the best cook in the world. Uncle Wolf didn't have chicken stew that night, but Mrs. Chicken fixed him a nice dinner anyway. Oh, shucks, he thought as he walked home. Maybe tomorrow I'll bake the little critters 100 scrumptious. Oh, it snuck up us. There's another scrumptious. Cookies. And then at the end there, we can make a little inference and say that, yes, he did make those scrumptious cookies. Okay. So I trust that everybody is listening for the word and rubbing their tummies. Okay, so after you're going to kind of revisit everything, right? And have this great discussion about the word. Now, if you're doing 2 words, you would have followed that same procedure. There would just be 2 words you'd be reviewing before, during, and after. So you're going to bring out your picture card again, and you're going to ask them to repeat the word. So we'll kind of go through this. So friends, one of the words we heard today in Wolf's Chicken Stew was scrumptious. What word? Scrumptious. That's right. Scrumptious means something very tasty or yummy. The next thing you're doing, Katie talked about this. You're going to go back into the book and revisit where those words were. Now you notice that scrumptious was mentioned a lot, I think like 5 or 6 times. That's not typical. There are some books where they'll have, a repetition of a word, but it's not typical. So don't feel that you have to find a book that mentions a vocabulary word several times. We start with this because, especially for young children, hearing that word multiple times helps alert them to their listening for words in the story. And eventually they'll be just listening for, just one word. Or mentioned one time. So don't feel that, you have to find a book like that to do a word walk lesson. So you're going to physically go back into the pages of the book. So I think our next slide shows going back into the book here. Yeah. So you would introduce friends. What was the first thing that Wolf made for Mrs. Chicken? And they'll say pancakes, right? And you'll say, well, what kind of pancakes? Scrumptious pancakes. Well, what does that mean, scrumptious? Oh, they were tasty and yummy. So you're having this conversation afterwards. And then you go to the next page and then you talk about the scrumptious donuts. You could even do a little comprehension because there's a sequence. They can, recall what he brought first, then next, and last. Certainly you can do those other pieces. So a scrumptious cake, and so on and so forth. And then you're gonna have a more of a discussion about the words at this point. So that step was going back into the book. Now you got to come out of the book. Especially for young children, they might feel that those are the only things that are scrumptious, or that's the only thing that I can refer to as scrumptious. We want them to see the word in their life. So on day 1, you'll have your vocabulary picture card, but you'll also have some additional pictures. And so you can see here in the screen, I have a picture that what looks like, like a Thanksgiving dinner, right? And you can talk to the students and they can share, do turn and talk. What is their favorite thing they eat on Thanksgiving? And you're going to be you're going to be listening to them and encouraging them to use the word scrumptious. And they'll need to be reminded of it. And then you'll start hearing scrumptious a lot, right? Another picture here with the ice cream. They could talk about their favorite ice cream. Again, encouraging them to say what word? Scrumptious. And then you say, friends, what word have we been talking about today? Scrumptious. Can you turn and tell your talking buddy what that means? Right? Something tasty or yummy. And so you see that repetition and the engagement and that piece that fits into the science of reading as well, introducing new vocabulary and really gauging on their personal interests. So you have that choice in the words that you're choosing. So that was day 1. Okay, so you can see that before, during, after. Teachers doing a lot of the directing. Day 2, you want to pull them back. Day 2, you want to remind them that they've read this great story yesterday. You want to encourage conversation. What happened? What does scrumptious mean? Do you remember all the scrumptious food that Mr. Wolf brought to her door? So you're doing that in your before reading piece, but again, following these steps. And we do have, these steps, and teachers really just feel comfortable with them after some time. You're going to reintroduce the card. They're going to show you the action. They're going to tell you the definition, and you're going to ask them to comment on the word. And that's what that conversation is before reading. So you should hear a lot more chatter from your students in day 2. During reading, again, you're going to read the story as you would. You can make some modifications, whether you're going to do some before, during, and after kind of comprehension, or some retelling, or some, inferring, whatever you're going to do. You can certainly modify with your comprehension piece, but you're going to follow that same piece, pausing when you come across the word, providing a quick child-friendly, and asking them to comment on the word. So in day 2, and you're going to stop when you come to that word and have them do more turn and talk about what the wolf brought and why it was scrumptious, what was scrumptious. And in the after piece, the big piece from day 1 to day 2 is you're still, you're going to reintroduce the card again, ask them to repeat the action and the definition, go back into the book. But you can see here, teacher invites the children to think of examples of using the word outside of the context of the book. So we're asking students now to do that. Previously, before word walk, when we got to that piece, students, especially our younger ones, were really just repeating what the teacher said, using an example. They hadn't had time to really process and get that input for them to give that output of their definition. So day 2, that piece there, and after reading, really is your kind of informal assessment if they can think of examples of what they think is scrumptious, right? And you want to encourage them to think of their own examples, and again, do that turning and talking and have them share what they think is scrumptious. So we have a quick recap here. I won't go through that, but we provided our teachers these steps. We had them on posters. They would kind of have it next to their chair so they could see the steps. But really, after some time, it really became quite intuitive and just part of their routine there. Okay, so how are we doing with time here? Okay, we have okay, great. So I wanted to give you a second at home or wherever you are to see if you could sort these words into the correct tiers. Remember, we talked about the tiers. So for example, sad would be a tier 1 word. Students already know that. Quadrilateral would be a content specific word. And then absurd, right, would be a tier 2 word, and that tends to be an adjective or adverb. So see if you can sort the rest of those words into the correct category just for like a minute, and then we'll go to the next slide in a second and check. Go to the next slide. All right. All right, so how about I say the word, and at home you can just say 1, 2, or 3, or do a finger for 1, 2, or 3, whatever you want to do. Okay, our first word is sad. Does that click when you do it, Katie? Okay, there it is. All right, sad is tier 1. Sinister, tier 2. And in the back of your mind, you can kind of be thinking about, what would your picture be? What would your definition be? Pulmonary, we know that's a tier 3. Tariff, 3. Excellent. That would be taxes. Frolic, yep, tier 2. Absurd, we said it would be a great tier 2 word. So many things are absurd. Hots, fast, tier 1, quadrilateral. Oh, the math stuff. Cease. Yes, tier 2, atom, tier 3, quiet would be a tier 1, photosynthesis. Oh, yes, some more great science. And last but not least, I hope no one is feeling that way today. Curious. Okay, very, very good. So how'd you feel about the tiers? And I think, that's really helpful when thinking about how do I select words. Being able to categorize words, any word that you're about to teach is really helpful. These are just some great books that we found on our bookshelves, very well-loved books, just to show that many of the books you have in your classroom probably would be filled with tier 2 words that you might have overlooked. Lisa, this is a pocket for corduroy. Lisa was reluctant to leave without corduroy, but her mother insisted. You can come back tomorrow, she said. I'm sure he will still be here. So if you had to choose a tier 2 word from this page, what would you choose? Anybody choose reluctant? I can't see the chat. But reluctant would be fantastic. Insist, yeah, insist would be a great one as well. And think about this. We'll be reading these to kindergarten children. And should they be using the word reluctant? Of course. Yes. Okay. Oh, Kevin Henkes and Chrysanthemum. Welcome home, said her mother. Welcome home, said her father. School is no place for me, said Chrysanthemum. They said I even look like a flower. They pretended to pick me and smell me. Oh, pish, said her mother. They're just jealous and envious and begrudging and discontented and jaundiced, said her father. Who wouldn't be jealous of a name like yours, said her mother. After all, it's absolutely perfect, said her father. I had to throw this in here because Kevin Henkes has the most wonderful vocabulary. And, Katie and I did not choose begrudging or jaundice for our word walk study, but they're still wonderful words, right? And those are fantastic for our older students, but take a look at all the wonderful words just popping out here for our students. What else do we have? Officer Buckle and Gloria. The next day, an enormous envelope arrived at the police station. It was stuffed with thank you letters from the students at Natville School. So enormous would be an excellent choice there. What else do we have? Click, clack, moo. Cows that type. Ooh, cows that type. Hens on strike. Whoever heard of such a thing? How can I run a farm with no milk and no eggs? Farmer Brown was furious. That's a great one too. And you can also think about like connecting other feelings words. So, choosing a word from word walk could then really, bring about some other words you might want to connect, inspire you to connect in your classroom. Okay, time-wise, we only have 10 more minutes. So Katie, do you think we should just kind of show them the words here? So if we had more time just for practice, this is a great book, everybody, Wild About Books. And so if we had time, we could read this to you. But it's very Dr. Seuss-like, rhyming, talking about how to treat books right. It's about a girl who developed, a library at the zoo. And it's just chock-a-block with wonderful words like conquer, devoured, resistance, attracted, stampeding, forsaking, outrageous, thrilling, enormous, wonderful. So, the question for you, you have your book, you have your words, which words are going to be most useful for you? So it might be that everybody in first grade is reading this book, but one teacher chooses some words different than the other. And that's fine, because that's the choice you have in word walk, because your students best. But really make sure that they're worthwhile for them. All of these could be, but you could always provide a rationale for what 2 or 3 would work best for your classroom. And your next piece, right, would be developing your vocabulary picture card for those words, developing a child-friendly definition, and explicitly talking about those words before, during, and after reading. And these are just some resources that we offer as well to help plan your lesson. Just the resources that if you just need that kind of run through, that they're there. So Katie's going to show you some examples of some extension activities we did.
Great. Thank you, Katie. So we talked about how repetition is key in effective vocabulary instruction and how using the word walk strategy to introduce the words in the context of a shared storybook reading is important. It gives you the context for choosing what kinds of words to introduce to students. But we also know from research that we have to continuously reinforce those words and extend them. So I'm going to fly through some examples. I know we're running out of time. We teachers that we worked with put the word cards from the words right on the wall as a word wall to remind the students what words they've been looking at. But it was also a great cue for the teachers to use those words and reinforce them throughout the year. We worked with teachers in kindergarten and older grades as well, so you can see bulletin boards with these words as reminders. They also, teachers put the words out on their parent bulletin board to encourage families to use and reinforce the target words each week at home, which is a really great reinforcement. One of the extensions that our teachers chose to do was the language experience approach. So talking about the words with children in a conversation and asking them, when was the time that you were furious? And then taking some teacher dictation to write down what each student said, to put the word in context of how it lives in their own lives. And you can see some different examples of LEA. There's research about acting out the target words, especially useful for English language learners to connect an action again to the word. So involving those kinds of active activities within the classroom day to reinforce the words that were introduced and used during a word walk lesson. We had teachers that encouraged children to use the words while they were in the art center. So one of the target words was enormous. And so a child painted something that was enormous to them. And in this case, it was an enormous happy face. Also thinking about how to use the words in the classroom in meaningful ways. So we had a teacher who had trouble, the children were congregating in the bathroom. So she put the alone picture card in the bathroom as a place where it was appropriate to be alone. And so we always thought that was a great way. Some teachers created games. So hand is a tier 1 word. Again, we were working with some English language learners. The book was The Kissing Hand. So they really needed to have an understanding of what hand was. So she took pictures of different students' hands and they were able to guess which friend belonged to this hand, and the same thing for grin, which we loved. But there are also extension activities for older students. We don't have time to run through each of these, but we have these in the resources and the handouts and the presentation. So there's some wonderful activities for older kindergarten, first, second grade here as well. Generating synonyms, generating antonyms, thinking about using the words in context and outside of context and creating sentences. Certainly concept webs are wonderful for our younger children using images, but then also examples and non-examples are a really great way to reinforce the words. And again, these are all examples of connections that you could create and bring in at different times during your classroom day. And, thumbs up, thumbs down. Are these things enormous or not? Having them illustrate the words, acting out the words. So all of these to say that we want to have different exposures to our rich, wonderful target words that we introduced during Word Walk. And research, used to tell us 14 exposures. Now I think we're up to 21 exposures per word for the word to truly live in a child's vocabulary so that they can use it meaningful in multiple contexts themselves. We have our planning pages as handouts if you'd like to use those. Final thought, just as you're thinking about vocabulary instruction, it should be meaningful, so picking words that are relevant to your students' lives. We want activities that are active, that are fun and engaging. We want them to love learning about new words. Also, we want to be strategic about the words that we're choosing. Katie talked a lot about tier 2 and tier 3 words as being the rich, wonderful target words that we want to select. in fiction or nonfiction, and purposeful. We don't want to choose words that our students this year already know. So thinking about, the data that you have on your students, you know your students best. So choosing words that are right for them, that will meet their needs. Thank you for attending today. We really enjoyed talking with you about word walk and effective vocabulary explicit instruction. And I think we just have a few minutes for some conversation. We do have our contact information up here. If you have any follow-up questions or would like any resources, we are happy for you to reach out as well.